In this video, we're going to finish up our rocks material. So in the previous video, we were able to create this pattern here that we're going to utilize on our cliffs in the scene. And so now I'd like to do a variation of this surface for the ground plane. And I started to work on that here already. So let me just hook in this height map that I've generated. So I'm just going to take the output, place this into my normal, and then place this into my height so that we can view this here in our 3D view. And so all I've done, just following the exact steps from the previous video, was that I took the instances here for my rock shape and just fed those through the tile random node to generate this height information here. So again, just same steps as I showed in the previous video. And so here's just kind of a different variation I'm getting with those rock shapes. And I'm going to utilize this again, like I said, for the ground. Now there's some extra detail that I would like to add here, and that would be like smaller pebble-like rocks. And what I'd like to do is just add this as some additional functionality here to my rock shape. So let's take a look at how we can do that. So I'm gonna just jump into the rock shape graph, and I've started to work through this already. And so here in this section, group of nodes that's going to create a pebble shape. And so here I'll just zoom in here in my 2D view and double click, and this is the shape that we're going to utilize. Now let me show you how I created this. Here, again, it's very similar to the process I showed in the last video, but we're just going to run through it here. So what I did was I started here with the Polygon 2 node and just set up some of the parameters to get a shape like this here. And then I used a directional warp. And so here's the noise that I'm using, just that Perlin noise 2, and I used a directional warp just to push the shape around so that it looks something like this here. And then I fed that into a second directional warp just to push the shape a little bit farther like this. And so notice that for the directional warp, the second one, I just fed in the input from the previous directional warp as both the input and the intensity input. So now we have this shape. So then what I would like to do is add a bit more kind of hard edges around into this base shape. So I started with another shape node, and this here is just the actual shape node itself. And here for the pattern, I set it to pyramid and set the tiling to 1, so we get this shape. I then use a transform node just to push this shape and rotate it around so that we get the pattern that looks more like this here. So this is our pattern, this is our previous shape, and then we're just going to blend these guys together to get this. Notice that I'm using the min darken mode. Then I just processed it with the levels so that we kind of sharpen up these corners here, get a little bit more intensity here on these hard edges, and that gives us our basic rock shape. I then grabbed the noise that we were using on our previous rock shape, ran that through a levels, and then again just multiplied that down onto our shape just to add a little bit of noise. And again, I wanted this to be extremely subtle, so I dropped the opacity down to a very low value. So now we have the difference of having this pebble shape and this overall kind of rock shape. So we have two different types of rock shapes that we can work with within this rock shape graph. So what I wanted to do was just add a mode. So for instance, I'm going to use my rocks, or I'm going to use kind of like this smaller rock or pebble type mode. So let's do that. Let's build in a mode that lets me toggle between which one of these types of shapes that I want to use. So what I'm going to do is just hit the space bar, and I'm going to grab this blend node here, and let's take our original rock shape and put that here into the foreground, and let's take our new rock shape and put that into the background. So here we'll zoom in on the graph and we'll take a look. So notice here on our blending mode we have this option here called switch. So it's close, it's right here. So we're going to utilize this blending mode called switch. Now switch works exactly like the copy mode. So it's basically like a foreground over background or A over B type of compositing operation. However, switch uses some optimizations internally. So if you're wanting to set up a blending where you're either going to show either 100% of the foreground or 100% of the background, so it's either on or off basically, you're going to want to utilize this switch mode because, like I said, it's more optimized internally within the blend node itself. So now that we have this, a way to control this switch, or basically flip it on and off, is through the opacity. So notice here with an opacity of 1, we're viewing the foreground, and if I set the opacity to 0, we're now viewing the background. Now, of course, you do have this blend between the two, but we're not really worried about that. We're just worried about 1 being the foreground and 0 being the background. So basically an on-off switch. Now, I'm going to double click here an empty spot to get to my root level and my input parameters, and I'm going to add a new input parameter. Now, for the type, I'm going to set this to a Boolean type, and this is going to give me a button. And so here you can see that default, it's set to false. This Boolean value is either going to return a 0 or a 1, where 0 is false and 1 is true. So here, let's go into our actual blend node and go to our opacity, and I'm going to create here an empty function for this. And let's go into the graph and let's create our function. So here I'm going to hit the space bar and I'm going to get that Boolean value. And here on the drop down, I'm going to choose input. Now I noticed here I forgot to rename that. So let's go back to our rock shape and let's come over here to input, and instead of identifier leaving it at input, let's just call this Pebble mode. So Pebble underscore mode. And here for our label, let's call it Pebble mode. Okay, so now back to this opacity, and you can see that it's already, reset with the correct name. Okay, so now that we have our variable, let's hit the space bar, and I'm going to start to type if to get this if-else statement. And so this takes a condition input, and notice here our Boolean value is a white, and here we have the condition as white. So that means these compatible data types. So let's take the output of our Boolean and let's place that here into the condition. So basically we know that our user input here is going to return either a true or a false. Now, if it's true, we're going to input a value into this if input, and if it's false, we're going to input a value here into the else input. So if our Pebble mode is true, here I'm going to hit my space bar, grab a float, because we know that the data type for the opacity slider on that blend is either going to be 0 or 1, and it has a float slider for the input, for the data type. So if the Pebble mode is true, I want to feed in here this 0. Because remember, if we have the opacity set at 1, that's going to show our foreground, and if the opacity is set at 0, it's going to show our background, which is our Pebble. So we're going to set this to 0. So here I'm going to just copy and paste this node, and then let's set this to 1, and let's put this into the else. So now I can right click here on my if else and set this as the output node. So now that we have that in place, let's go back here to our root or our parent graph, and let's take this new node and just connect this here to our output. And so here, let's take our Pebble mode, and I'm just going to drag and drop this here towards the very top. Again, just to test it, if I come over here to my Pebble mode, again, default is set to false. Let's turn it on, so we hit true, and it shows our Pebble. Turn it off or use false, and it shows our original shape. So now we have this set. Let's just save our package, and let's go back to our main rocks graph. Okay, so let's come back over here to the new height map that we've been creating. And so this is what we have. Let's take our rock shape, and let's make a new instance of this here into our graph. And notice now we have our new Pebble mode, so let's hit true to this, and now we have our Pebble. So what I'm going to do here in this case is I'm just going to take this tile random here and just copy and paste it. So we'll see if we can't reuse some of this here. And so let's take the output and we'll place this here into the pattern input. Actually, I'm sorry, I have that wrong. Let's take our rock shape, and that is going to be our pattern input. And we want to take, what we've done thus far here, and we want to use this as the background. So here, let's double click and take a look at what we have here with this node. And we've got our background set up. So what we need to do now is just probably increase here our X and Y amount. So here you can see we're starting to get some of these pebbles. Let's plug this here into our normal and our height so that we can see this in the 3D view before we start making a lot of tweaks to that tile node. So there's our normal, there's our height, and right click view in 3D view so we can see what we're getting here. And so we're starting to get some of these rocks, but again, since I copy and pasted that tile random, our parameters are not really set like we need. So like I said, I started here with this X and Y amount. Let's come down to our shape scale and let's pull this value down quite a bit. And so here we're starting to see these rocks. And since we're using the scale, some of them are smaller here, so we can maybe think of these as more like pebble type. So here I'll just pull that size down. Let's go back up here to the top. Let's increase our X and Y amount, maybe 14 and 14. So there we go, something like that. And again, I'll just keep playing around here with some of these settings here to get the look I'm wanting to achieve. Okay, so here I've just gone in and just tweaked these settings here from my tile random to produce the overall design that you see here that I'm going to use for my ground plane. So now I'd like to start to add some of the extra details that we added here for our cliff. So for instance, some of these different noises here, just to add that secondary level of detail. So let's just grab the nodes that we have thus far here, and let's just kind of move these guys down. And here, these are going to be, this is my normal and my base material. And so what I want to do here is start to just kind of blend in some of these other noises. So here I'm going to grab a blend, and let's take a look at what we have here. So here is where we started to add in this grunge map noise, and I'm just going to reuse this as well. So let's see what we had from before. Notice that we used a blend with a multiply, and we had this opacity here. So let's do the same thing. Let's just take the output here from that levels, and then we're going to blend these guys together. So let's take our tile random, our final or our third tile random. We'll plug this here into the blend node, and let's set our blending mode to actual multiply here. And we'll drop the opacity down somewhat. Now let's go ahead and just take the result here of this blend, and let's just output this here to our normal and our height so that we can see this here in our 3D view. Okay, so here you can see the result of us just adding some of that grunge here onto the overall material here for our ground. So let's go back to this opacity, and maybe I'll just increase this a bit. Let's see what we get here. And there we go. We can probably just use something like this here. Now, I think I might actually go back over here to my tile random where I have my my actual pebbles, and let's go to the scale, and let's just drop the scale down just a bit more. So let's make these guys just a little bit smaller. Let's just experiment with doing that. And on that tile random, I'm also going to take a look at my color randomization. So right now I don't have any color randomization, so I can actually kind of change the height depth here. So let's just go in and just, well, not the background color, but the color random. Let's introduce a little bit of this color random so you can see that that's going to give the effect of just taking some of the rocks and just kind of, you know, pushing them down, you know, making it look like some are higher, some are lower, and so on. So again, just a little bit of extra randomization in there. Okay, so I think we're just going to work with this. And so all I'm going to do, the striations that we added before, we're not going to add those again. So those are going to be kept in here. That was actually added at this top portion. Those are going to be kept for the other material. So at this time, we now have our two different materials. So here we have our cliffs, and then here we have our materials, or basically the height information that we're going to use for our ground. So now we're going to run through the process of exposing some user parameters. And what I would like to do is first start by creating a parameter that's going to allow me to choose which type of height information that I want to utilize in an instance graph. So to do this, let's double click an empty spot. Let's come over here to our root level, and we're going to start with our input parameters. And I'm going to click here the new input tweak button, and for float I'm going to change this to integer 1, and instead of slider I'm going to choose drop down list. And this is going to allow me to create a drop down list. In this list we're going to have two items. So here for the first item, let's type in cliff, and for the second item let's use ground. Notice here that I can set a value for one of these options. So we're going to have 0 and 1. Now, just as I showed earlier, by utilizing the blend node with the switch blending option, we're going to be able to create a drop-down list that allows us to choose which one of these height values we're going to work with. So here, let's create a blend node, and we are going to add in our height, and in the background we're going to add in our ground. So here you can see that we have our blend. So at a blend of 1 we're going to be showing this version of the height map, and at a blend of 0 we're going to show the ground. Of course, for optimization, let's take our blending mode and set that to switch. So like I said, at 0, we're showing the ground. Let's take a look at what I have for my input parameters and make sure. Here, let's actually change this. So ground and cliff. So like I said, 0 and 1. Okay, so now we need to come in here to our opacity, and we need to set an empty function. So let's come in here and create our empty function. And here I'm going to hit the space bar and get integer. And we're going to want to choose our input here. Now, once again, I forgot to name that. So here, let's go out here to our root level. And for the identifier, I'll just call this height underscore mode. And here for the label, let's just call this surface type. So we're going to have a drop-down list that allows us to choose between a ground or a cliff surface type. And here, notice that I have this checkbox. This allows me to set which one of these guys is going to be default. So here, ground, I'm setting this as the default. So here, we can go back to that opacity blend. Our height mode is set. Now, this is an integer, and so we're going to have a little bit of trouble here using our if-else statement. So like I said before, this is taking in a conditional input, and notice here that I get this red connection. So we can't actually do this. So first, we need to make a comparison. So here I'll hit the space bar, and I'll start to type in com, and here I get some comparison operators. Let's just go with equal. So here, I'm going to take my height mode and just plug this into A. So basically, I'm going to see if A and B are equal. And here again, I'm going to hit my space bar and I'm going to start to type in integer. Now remember, this is an integer, so we need an integer type. Both of the outputs are yellow, and so we have this set to 0. So basically now, I have a conditional output, and I'm asking if whatever was chosen here in the height mode, if it's equal to 0, we're going to output a true. And if it's not, we're going to output a false. Now, since we only have these two options, this is going to work pretty easy for us. So here, let's take our output and let's plug this into the condition of our if statement. So we know our ground is in the background of that blend node, and that needs to be a 0. So here we're saying if the height mode is equal to 0, and that's true, we need to put a value here in the if. And what we're going to do is use a value of 0. Now remember, for opacity, we need float. So let's just hit the space bar. Let's grab a float, and let's place the float in the if. So here we'll copy and paste our float, and we're going to set this to a value of 1. And so here, if our height mode is not equal to 0, it's going to then utilize whatever value we place here in the else. And we know that needs to be a 1. Actually, I messed this up. I hit the wrong value, so that's a 0, and I needed to have this guy selected when I set this to 1. Now we'll connect the 1 into the else statement. So now that we have this set up, we can right-click our if-else, and we can set this as our output. So let's go back to our rocks, double click here to go to the root level of the graph. Let's just preview our control. Here's our surface type is set to ground, and we see the ground. And if we choose cliff, you can see here that we get the cliff. So now we have this nice little user control for switching between which type of surface we want to utilize. So we have another surface type that we want to work with, and that's going to be our rock striations on our cliff. So let's set our mode to cliff so that we can see this. And we need to make sure that we come over here to where we have our striations, and we're actually going to enable these. So first, I'm going to come over here to my input parameters, and let's add a new input. And this time, let's add a boolean as well. And here, for the label, let's call this show striations. And for our input identifier, let's just call this rock striations. Okay, so now we have this set, and we're going to leave it to false by default. So again, going back to our histogram scan, we know that with our contrast set to 1, we don't see any of the striations, and with our contrast set to 0, we see the striations. So here we have this basically a toggle that we want to create. So what we're going to do is come over here to our contrast, and we're going to create an empty function. Now let's edit that empty function. Here we need to hit our space bar, and we need to get that boolean value. And let's, from the drop down list, let's choose rock striations. Here I'll hit the space bar again and start to type if. Let's get our if-else statement. So, very simple, just as before. So let's take our output here of our boolean value and plug this into our condition. Now we know that that contrast is a float data type, so I'm going to hit the space bar and grab float here. And we're going to have a 0 and a 1. So let's take this float and let's just copy and paste it, and let's paste this here at 1. So if the rock striations parameter is set to false, we know that we want our contrast to be 1, so let's put that into the if input. If our rock striations is set to true, we know we want that contrast to be a 0 value, so let's place this into the else input. So now we have this set, let's set this as output node. Now let's test it. So we've made a change, let's test it. Let's go to our input parameters. Looks like I actually have this backwards here. So default, we set this to true. Okay, then that's going to go away. So what we want to do is let's just go back into this contrast here. I actually had these backwards. So if rock striations is set to true, that means we need our contrast to be 0. And if it's false, we need our contrast to be 1. So I just had those guys flipped. So here we'll go back and let's just enable this. So show striations is set to false. We don't see them. If we enable it, now we see them. Now another thing that we can do with this, if we come over here to ground, notice that we still see this striations control, and we don't really need to actually see that here for ground because it's not really an option for our ground. So what I'm going to do is set it to where this show striations is only visible if the surface type is set to cliff. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to copy this identifier name. And for every parameter, there is an option here in the visible if. So we can write a little expression here that allows us to basically set the visibility for a parameter based on the value of another parameter. And this is really powerful for creating, user-friendly controls, especially once we get over into our game engine. So here, I'm going to start to type in the word input. And then I'm going to use a left bracket, a quote, and now I'm going to paste the identifier name that I'm trying to target, and then we'll use a close quote here, and then a right bracket. So using this syntax here, I'm basically looking for an input with the name of height underscore mode. Notice under our surface type, that's what our identifier here is. So using that syntax, I'm able to target this parameter. Now I need to test the value for it. So we know that our cliff value is equal to 1. So here in our visible if, we can say if input height mode is equal to 1. That means that this parameter is only going to be visible if our height mode's value is set to 1. So let's now preview this and take a look. So notice our surface type, we only see ground. I'm going to click my drop down, I'm going to change this to cliff, and now I get my cliff with my striations control. So here I'll just disable this and I'll reset this back and I'll undo my preview. So now I want to add one more control here. So this time let's click our input parameter and we're going to leave this at float, and let's set this to angle, and for our identifier we're going to call this striation rotation. Because we might want to change the angle of this striation depending on how we may have rotated the rock object in our game engine. So now that we have this for our label, let's just also call this striation rotation, or actually I'm just going to call this rotation. Okay, so we have this set up. Let's come back over to our show striation and let's just copy our visible if expression because we're going to use this for our rotation as well. So here in our visible if, we'll paste that. So now that we have that finished, we're going to come over here to that transform. So remember early on I said that we're just going to add this transform because we're going to use this rotation. And just as we've done before, we need to be able to set the rotation here on this matrix. So here I'm going to create an empty function. We'll edit the empty function. I'm going to hit my space bar. I'm going to get that float that we just created for the input parameter. Let's choose it here through our drop down. So notice here we have our striation rotation. So now that we have this in place, here we can come over to our functions. Actually, I think I'll just search for it here in the spacebar menu. I'll start to type in RO, and then here we see rotation matrix. That's what we want. Let's take our float and place that here into the input of the rotation matrix. Right click, set as output. All right, so now we're here in our rocks. Let's go back to this. Let's go back to our input parameters and let's preview this control. So first, let's set this to cliff. Let's show our striations, and here we have our turns and degree. So I think at default here, I'm going to set this to 90 so that we keep these horizontal. So let's just set this 90 degrees as our default. So when I turn off my preview, I have the option here to apply as default, and that's what we'll do. Now, one other thing I think I'm going to do just to improve the usability of this controls that I'm setting up here is let's come over here to striations. Let's copy this. And since we only want to be able to see our rotation control if the show striations is enabled, let's use that in the visible if instead. So here, I'm just going to remove that height mode input, and I'll paste in that rock striations, and I'm still going to leave this equal to 1 because this is a Boolean value where 0 equals false and 1 equals true, and so this is going to give me a valid expression. So let's preview it one more time. So here you can see I'm back to Cliff. If we take show striations and turn that off, now our rotation is gone. If we switch this back to ground, we only see this option for ground. And that's going to conclude all of the input parameters that we want to set up for this material. So I'll unpreview, and since I have it set up the way I want now, let's apply the default values. So here we can take a look, and this gives us our final output here for what we want to work with. And now the last thing that we want to do is actually create the outputs that we're going to work with. So what I'm going to do is hit the space bar here, and I'm going to start to type output, and I'm going to create an output node. And let me make sure. I think I already had some in here, and I did. What do I have? Oh, just those defaults. So let's select these guys, and let's just delete them. We're not going to use those. So here for the usage, let's set this to height. And for the identifier, we'll set this to height. And for our label, we'll set this to height. So we have this guy in place. So now we're going to output this height. I think I would also like to be able to output some normal information from this as well. So let's do another output for the add item. Let's set this to normal. Our label will be normal, and our identifier will be normal. So here we already have a normal creation node that we've been using. So let's just use this guy. So here, I am not going to use that base material anymore. Now, here's something that I can show you a trick for. So here in this normal node, notice that, we're seeing transparency in here, and we don't really want that. So if I turn off that transparency, this is the type of normal that we want to see. But notice here we're getting this transparency. So I want to get rid of this. An easy way to do that, let's just select the connection line here, and let's add a levels. And then here in this levels, for the channel, let's set this to alpha, and let's just take our output black and move this all the way up to basically where the output white is. And that'll get rid of that alpha for us. So now we just have our normal. And I think I would also like to output some curvature for this as well. So what I'm going to do is hit the space bar, and I'm going to start to type in curvature. And we have two types. I'm going to utilize this curvature smooth. And so the curvature smooth here is going to take a normal as input. And we have normal information, so let's just grab it here from our levels and just plug this in. And here is some nice curvature data that we can utilize. So here, I'm going to hit my space bar. Let's create an output. And for the usage, let's choose curvature. So here, we should have a curvature. And here it is. For the label, let's do curvature. And for the identifier, we'll set it to curvature. And we'll plug this guy in. So now we have our complete rocks graph that's going to give us a utility for creating rocks for our ground and for the cliffs. We're also outputting here our height, normal, and curvature data so that we can use this once we instance this graph here within another graph when we start to compile our main material. So after taking a look at some of the settings we have, I found two problems that I want to address. So number one here is in the way that I actually have this normal map hooked up. So here, let's just really quick go back to our parameters, and here, let's just view the height information that we have, and let's go back to our parameters. And for our surface type, let's switch this to cliff. So we see our cliff, but the normal map is still generating based on, here I'll just view the normal map in the 2D view, it's still generating based on this node here. So all we need to do is just make sure that for the blend switch node that's basically acting as a toggle between the two branches here of our surfaces that we've set up, we need to make sure that we route this guy here to the normal as well. And so now you'll see that cliff mode is actually correct with the normal. Here let's go back to our actual surface type, and I'll switch this to ground. And here you can see that our ground is now working. Now, the other problem here is with our ground in the sense that here, I'm going to take our 3D view and just kind of rotate this over here to the side. And you can see that, I'm getting, I'm utilizing the height here in the material. So here, let's go to our materials, edit, and then here you can see, I've just really overcranked this scale to prove this point. So all the rocks look good except for the actual pebbles themselves. Here you can see that, since this height is set to a very high scale value, the pebbles are being displaced extremely high. So what I think we should do with this is just change a little bit of the structure here. So for instance, where we're adding in this tile random, instead of feeding the background, which is going to be this tile random that we have here, I think we should just add this tile random here with our pebbles separately. So let's just take this tile node here, let's bypass our pebbles and plug this here into our blend. So that's going to essentially just get rid of our pebbles. So here we have our pebbles. We're not going to place anything into the background. So when we take a look at this node here, I'll just double click to view it here in the 2D view. We have just our pebbles. So now what I'm going to do is just bring this guy up. I'm going to introduce a new blend. Place our rock shapes here into the foreground. And here, let's take our blend here and let's place this into the background. And for the blending mode, we are going to utilize that max lighten just as we did before. So here we have our rocks again. And here, let's just zoom out here in our graph. And now let's take this guy and place it here into the background. So this is going to put us right back to the situation we had before where the pebbles are being displaced, way too high. However, now what we can do is, since we've kind of broken this out into its own node, we can utilize this opacity. So what I'm going to do is just drop this to 0.5. And so now you can see that I was able to just drop the height value for just those pebbles. And that's going to give me the overall depth range that I need for both the rocks and the pebbles. And so I have that in place for when, we're using a very high scale value. And it's also going to work. So if I go to my material edit and I go back to my scale, and say I just drop this scale down pretty low here, maybe something that's going to, work more like what we see inside of Unity. So maybe something like this 0.14 or so. You can see that it's still, working correctly in that sense of the overall depth range. So I just kind of rerouted a few nodes to get a better overall result.